Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for our live chat with Tom Linton to discuss the state of the supply chain for the first half of 2022. My name's Melissa Geringer. I oversee corporate communications for Resilinc. Some housekeeping to get us started. We'll be doing a Q&A at the end of the webinar, so please use the question tab to send in your questions, and we'll do our best to cover them today, time permitting. Also, please know we'll be recording the webinar and making it available to you after the broadcast. And with that, I'd like to welcome our two main speakers today, Glenn Wilensky and Tom Linton. Glenn is Resilinc's Vice President of Customer Success. In this role, he oversees the team responsible for helping our customers achieve supply chain resiliency through mapping, monitoring, and risk assessments. Glenn will be moderating today's webinar with our special guest, Tom Linton. Tom is a recognized supply chain industry expert. He previously served as Chief Procurement and Supply Chain Officer of Flex, and held similar positions at LG Electronics and Freescale Semiconductor. Currently, he is a senior advisor at McKinsey & Company and an advisor to other companies, including Resilinc. A warm welcome to you both, and Glenn, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Melissa. I appreciate that. And Tom, welcome. Welcome to everybody joining the webinar. We appreciate your attendance. And hopefully, you'll get some good information out of this. I want to start with a little bit of a recap of what we've seen the last couple years, COVID-related disruptions, other disruptions, and this data is right out of our EventWatch event monitoring platform. And we've seen, it used to be called a black swan event. Now I think if we have a white swan event, which would be no disruption, we'd be lucky. Everything's a black swan event. And as you look at that and see what's going on, you can see from our chart that predominant, again, factory fires were number one, and then you start looking at business drivers as other events that have really caused major disruptions in the world of supply chain. Tom, I want to get your thoughts on this. I know you've had this discussion with us before, and the data looks similar. Any surprises to you?
It's interesting. I think factory fires has been number one for, I don't know if it's 4 or 5 years or longer, but I think we overlook the fact that a lot of supply chain, especially materials, right, are built in developing nations, even to the extent that they use today. We all know, because we get Amazon delivered to our door, a lot of corrugated. They use a lot of flammable materials, and it doesn't take much for any of you all who have toured factories in some of these countries to understand that housekeeping and some of those issues really do create some enormous risks. And I, for one, I've dealt with them many times over my career, and they come sometimes from major fires and major disruptions to even just smaller consequential ones where a fire might create risks downstream to all the other suppliers that are impacted, maybe 1 or 2 layers below you. So no, it doesn't surprise me. The one that surprises me on the business side is just how much M&A and business leadership transformation, all those things that are normal, not abnormal, right? All those things which tend to occur all the time, how big those are.
Yeah, I think when you start adding those categories together, really all around the business, it almost equals factory fire, if not a little bit more.
Yeah. Sure.
And unfortunately, I think as we see inflation increasing and some of the economic downturn that's being forecasted, these are probably going to be, next year when we talk even higher on the chain.
Yeah. What's interesting, right, is in terms of events, the pandemic is just like a slow boil now, right? It's just constantly in the background, and it's not even dealt with specifically, right? It's dealt with more as it kind of just raised the overall risk of everything that's done, and some of those things that are listed here are actually a result of that, right? I mean, think about port disruption, some of the labor disruptions that occurred in China because of the shutdowns and other places. So I think I like to call it consequential risk, right? Where things happen in law, they call it consequential damages, right? You had an air conditioner caught on fire in a building, and then the building burned down, but the actual risk was the air conditioner catching fire. And so I think the issue around consequential risk and consequential damages is something that people don't often think about, but a lot of these things tend to expand, right? They land and they expand. A risk is not solitary in its occurrence. It tends to actually create other things, and they snowball in many cases. And we saw that in semiconductors. We saw that in plastics. We saw that in lumber. We saw those things happen, early in the pandemic, and then ripple their way through the automotive supply chain and others.
Yep. And we kind of looked at this also not just from a disruption type, but really from industry, the different types of disruptions in each industry. As you can see, life sciences had a huge increase, or a huge number, but the biggest delta was really in like SaaS and SaaS type offerings. Saw disruptions that people probably never thought about. Any thoughts on this data and what you're seeing here?
Well, we've introduced new risks into our supply chains, right? I mean, if you have software as a service, if you have software as a service, if you're contracting for that kind of thing, and that goes down, and we've all experienced it. You get the email that says, we're going to be down for the next 6 to 10 hours. What happens is business stops. So it's not a fire. It's basically almost innocuous, right? It's a quiet killer of business. But yeah, things that cyber attacks is another one similar to that, but different. I think there's a lot of risks that we have introduced to ourselves, and having really strong plans around that is just as important as whether or not you make sure that you audit a factory to make sure that they're not as susceptible to factory fires. I think understanding what your backup plans are if your software goes down, what is your manual process to support that should there be a disruption in some software that you're using.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think the one thing that is implied here to even know this data is that you have to map your supply chain. So you have to understand, where your sites are that are making parts down tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, tier X, right? To understand that, but that's where we have the least visibility. So most, companies only have, a good view of their tier 1 and maybe some view of tier 2. And as we see, they generally don't have much view, if any, at tier 3 and beyond. And I think that's where, we've found our mapping technology allows that visibility, which helps so that you do know and you can inspect those factors that you were talking about that you otherwise have no clue about.
Right. Yeah. The canary in the coal mine, right? I mean, it's where do you first sense that a problem is occurring that's about to hit you, right? It's upstream in the supply chain, or in this case, in the supply mapping environment. So not having that, there's very uncomfortable conversations as a chief procurement officer or a chief supply chain officer if you've got to walk in and explain to your CFO, CEO, or board members, why this disruption is happening. Just not knowing when this is available to you and not to use it and not to monitor it and not to map it, I think puts you in a very awkward situation. I know back, when I remember Kobe earthquake in Japan, right? I mean, the only way I could find out what was going on was the roads were closed, so I put people on motorcycles and we weaved our way up into the mountains of Japan to see, whether the ThinkPad that we were building in Kobe, the covers were actually whether that factory was down or not. We had no way of knowing, pre-internet, right? But now this is just, it's kind of like you have the technology and you have the tool, but you're not using it, right? It's really, to me, hard to explain to any executive, when something is available, not to use it. I think that's kind of where I come from on this. I would use it extensively and drive it hard to understand, every linkage, every synapse in that supply chain, and what the consequential risk might be if something were to happen in tier 3 or tier 2.
Great.
Trust me, when the first tier tells you, trust me, we've got this figured out, I go back to trust but verify. I can't, you're still, you're on the hook. Just because your supplier says I got you covered doesn't mean that you're not responsible for it.
Yeah, and they end up, that tier one says I've got you covered because their tier one said so, but they have no clue 2 tiers down themselves, right?
Right.
And that's where the disruption is.
Exactly. And the reality is there will be a disruption. It's just how soon do you know about it? And a lot of times, I often say supply chains are selfish. Every company is out for themselves. And so if you find out something before someone else does, you can take corrective action. You can buy surplus inventory for that material in the market. You can begin to, if it's a port issue, whatever, you can reroute your materials. There's a lot of things you can do that are preemptive to what your competitors might be able to do. And so it's really competitive advantage by not doing this, right? You end up with also your ability to react is not just to react to the issue, but to actually react faster than your competitors react, right? It comes down to who gets there first in terms of figuring it out and solving it, as whether you get competitive advantage out of it. And I believe that in a risk situation, there's an opportunity to beat your competitor, whoever that may be, just because you're doing it better, faster than he is, because your visibility is greater than his is or hers.
Agreed. All right. I want to switch gears a little, and I want to talk about, what we're seeing today, and everybody hears it in the news, nearshoring, it can revitalize the U.S. economy, or, we need more U.S. factories, or is just in time gone away? And it looks like, to me, and I'd love to get your take on this, there's a lot of band-aiding going on here.
Well, I've coined a word called safe shoring. No matter where you are, I think there's less risk in what's nearby. And Rob Hanfield and I have another book coming out in August called Flow: How the Best Supply Chains Thrive. And we kind of talk about things like distance and how risk can actually be mitigated just by having a handle on your suppliers and your materials, line of sight, so to speak, on your suppliers. And we've gotten to the point now where things are so far strung out around the world, but that's not necessarily the way it should be. And I argue all the time, and I have a lot of companies I've talked to about this recently, where your supply chain isn't something that you have to live with the way it is. You can put strategies in place to change it. You can put strategies in place to transform it, and you don't have to live with it the way it is, because you're always going to be in a reaction mode. You're always going to be trying to dealing with the way it is. And supply chains are about time. They're about distance. The balance sheet of a supply chain basically is cash and material in motion. So how do you do that better? You compress it, you compress time, you shorten the distances, you put line of sight there, you have less risk when it's nearby. You do things that are safer and better. And I don't care if you're in China, you should do that closer to yourself. If you're in US, you should do it closer to yourself. If you're Europe, you should do it closer to yourself. I mean, why did we get into a situation where, by design, things are being flown all over the place, back and forth across the ocean? Balance sheets are fat, or I mean, there's a lot of inventory in them because of this stuff tied up in the oceans. And not to go back into history, but back in the 80s and 90s, interest rates were quite high. I mean, not as high as they are yet now, but the Fed's talking about another 0.75% rise. And you watch what happens. All of a sudden, interest rates will get to the point where the carrying cost of your materials along distances is going to become a tripping point for how you source, because it's the cost of capital. One day of inventory in the ocean, that's cash that's being confined in that material while it's moving across the ocean, where all of a sudden now you're going to say, well, I can fly it, and because the cost of money is so much higher now, I really can't consume my cash for that length of time. So we were constantly dealing with double-digit interest rates in the 80s, and that was what we were dealing with. And now it's coming back again. We forgot that interest rates can go up because we've been in a period of time, 20 years or more, where they've been okay. And when you start to get to double-digit interest rates, the distance where things are located has a big impact on the balance sheet, and they become real consumers of cash. So I would say that's a risk, and just on the financial side of thing. And I think people get hung up too much on the politics of one way or the other, right? Whether it be China or the U.S. or wherever they're sourcing, but they should think more financially about what this is all about and how to make it safer, less risk, and better financially, just by starting the process of transforming their supply chain to something more regional, more manageable.
So designing into their engineering, the supply chain.
De-risk your supply chain by designing it in to how your footprint is established, once you have your map in place, you look at your map and you say, okay, now how can I better optimize this supply chain? And sometimes back in LG, I had conversations about suppliers that were in Korea, and I said, look, we're going to have a factory in Mexico, and I need you to be there. I don't want you to be shipping things from Korea all the way to Mexico. I want you to establish a manufacturing operation, like a first tier or second tier, in and around that facility in Mexico. Now, we had huge purchasing power to do that, but those kinds of things, where we need to talk about how do we talk to these suppliers that are maybe not where we need them to be, and talk to them about working with them on putting them where we need them to be.
So do you think just in time is dead, or do you think it's a hybrid? How do you feel about that?
We get hung up on just in time, which was the Japanese delivering only what they needed to the factory, right, to the point where it was to be consumed. But now, to be honest with you, most things are outsourced. So my more recent work was in contract manufacturing, right? So contract manufacturers are constantly holding inventory for customers. So in other words, OEMs have already pushed a lot of the inventory out to the first tier contract manufacturer. So that's part of the business model. So I think people get hung up on just-in-time manufacturing because it's not the issue. The issue is you're moving inventory around the world, up and down your supply chain. It's your stuff. You're the final consumer of it. And you might be pushing it financially out from you, right? But just because you're pushing it out from you, but it's still far away. You've added the risk of it being done far away from where your point of consumption is. So just because financially it makes you look better, in this case, because you pushed it out, it doesn't mean that the risk is any less. In fact, you could argue it's more, because you don't have direct line of sight on it. In 2011, December 2011, it's in the public domain now, so some of the people listening can look it up. In the Harvard Business Review, I co-wrote an article, don't let your suppliers control your supply chain. It was December, I think, of 2011, for those looking for it. And in that article, I talked about, look, here are the things you got to look at before you throw the baby out with the bathwater, before you outsource. And I know I'm speaking to a lot of companies that have a significant amount of outsourcing, that they've gone to, contract manufacturing to do. And I think we need to constantly look, even though I wrote that, 11 years ago now, I think it's still incredibly valid as far as how we need to think about risk and supply chain management. And this was an article they were doing on risk management.
Okay, great. I think everybody really should go look at that. It's interesting how things remain relevant, or things that happened in the past come back, right? We see them over and over again.
Yeah. I mean, I know there's always different political environments, but supply chains are, I have a 3-word definition: material in motion. And as long as it's moving, it's okay. And the volatility occurs when you have a disruption to that motion. So, the CFO would call it cash in motion, right?
Yeah.
But this movement of material up and down these tiers, right, and the velocity with which it moves requires visibility to make sure that you can see what you have and how more efficiently you can move it. And this is why we go back to mapping as something. That's why I got excited about what Resilinc was doing originally, just because it was shining a light on the third dimension of supply chain management. I mean, we've been living in a transactional supply chain world, 2-dimensional, I call it, over the last, say, 30, 40, even 100 years, you could say. Purchase orders, invoices, this, that, right? But now we have new tools which give us the third dimension of supply chain. It's almost like an MRI of the supply chain, if you will. And would you go, 100 years ago, you go to a doctor and he feels around to see if your bone is broken, right? And then X-ray came along and you could say, well, okay, we don't have to feel around anymore. We can actually set the bone. And MRI actually even got more sophisticated and said, well, we got to be careful we don't, damage these nerves when we reset the bone. And so, there's all this kind of stuff now, and I think it's to adopt those technologies is really table stakes, is necessary in order to have the dimensional view of your supply chain that you may be missing or may not have a full picture of.
Talk about, what we're seeing, not just in the normal disruption, but now that we have more visibility into labor violations and things like forced labor, and you have what's going on, DOD announcing that you have to, really understand where things are coming from and trying to get away from the Uyghur conflict and things like that. How is that really, what do you see that as an effect to what we're doing in the supply chain today?
Well, it goes back to what I said about this, outsourcing risk. People push things out, around. It's kind of like, I was joking with my kids the other day because I was getting on their case about, separating the trash, right? Plastic, metal, and food into different bins, as we all have to do. But it's kind of like, it's, in the past you throw it all in the bag and it go on the ground, and it's somebody else's problem. But now with the way the world is structured, right? You can't just say that, my third tier, is mining cobalt, by children in the Africa, and you can't just not concern yourself with that. And you cannot avoid the fact that with human rights being so important in the American agenda and most corporate agendas, you can't just not concern yourself with that. So times have changed, and I think, not having visibility to these things again is just going to get you to an enormous amount of trouble with your board, with your customers. Customers are going to start to say, "What are you doing? What are you doing in China? Why did I read this article where it mentioned that you're using the, forced labor?" Those kinds of things, I think, are just the reality of where things have moved to. I think when you look at politics, I just saw, in fact, in the Wall Street Journal today, or yesterday was, I guess, that this $52 billion they want for semiconductors is still hung up. And yet, we think that's going to be a panacea. But, I spent 10 years in semiconductors as a chief procurement officer. And, these fabs will take many years to get approved, many years to build. We're talking about something that's going to have an impact, at least 5 years from now. So, yeah. So it's a long way out in a long, and not a quick fix to anything.
Yeah, I think I saw something, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, that those fabs, once they're up and running, is only like 4% of the production needed anyway in the US.
Right. And, of course, there are geopolitics in this too, because of where things are made today and, where they need to be made, in the future. So, and I'm sure that there's going to have to be a hard look at a lot of those things because of, more recently because of the Ukraine conflict.
Yeah. Well, speaking of conflicts, I know, one thing that is lurking, and we'll talk about some others in a minute, but is the possibility of a conflict, in Taiwan, and what that would mean especially to the global chip making market.
I'd be a lot more worried about a major earthquake in Hsinchu in Taiwan than I would be about China invading Taiwan. I think, the reality is, Taiwan is a highly earthquake-prone country. 80 to 90%, as I recall, of the high-end semiconductors that are used in the world today come from Taiwan. And think about that disruption for a minute. An 8.0 earthquake that destroys a large section of. I don't know if you've ever been there. I've been there many times in Hsinchu, Taiwan, where these large fabs are located. And it's an earthquake-prone area. as is Japan. And so a major disruption there would more likely come from an earthquake than I think from anything that China might do. I think, if you look at supply chains, I think it's more important you look at what China's strategy is. You mentioned, you put up front there the Silk Road issue. But what is the U.S. strategy for this, right? What is the U.S. plan for its global supply chain infrastructure? You think about how things are designed, right? You look at just the way that things are designed today. I mean, we wrote an article with India, with Resilinc data, June of last year, I think it was, on the Pan-American opportunity that we have. The Pan-American supply chain is really the north-south supply chain that's missing. If you look at that map, right, if you go to the U.S. side, it's, there's the infrastructure that you can't drive a truck, take a train, drive a car anywhere from Alaska down to Tierra del Fuego, down to the tip of Argentina. You can't do it. It's not there. There's no way to no infrastructure there yet. Look at this map. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done with our second and third largest trading partners, Canada and Mexico. Let's get our heads off of the all the politics around building a wall and start, well, how do we create a more integrated transportation network between these countries? We have a decent one, but not anywhere near what China's doing with this Silk Road initiative, which is, by the way, which is now 9 years old. So I think we need a strategy, a supply chain strategy, not necessarily just focusing on semiconductors and chips. I think we need infrastructure in that way to make this more productive. The shame of the U.S. system, right, is we end up states bidding against each other for factories and business. It's really like 50 countries when it comes down to this kind of solution, right? Well, oh yeah, we'll do the infrastructure and for you, and we'll build the roads for you and do all this, and yet now you're competing with another state in that regard. So I think a better integrated national supply chain strategy, I think, is going to be a better way to de-risk the North American, South American continent over time, over the next, say, 100 years, if there was a more thoughtful way of doing it.
Well, I think the chart on the right, though, is a telling sign even for that. When you look at the investment other countries, and this one's just China, but are making for financing in South America, in Caribbean, and in Mexico, and it's substantial. I mean, if you think about Venezuela, we talk about that, being able to get to Tierra del Fuego. Well, you have to go through Venezuela,
right? Yeah, I remember I was in Dubai several years ago. I was talking to their government. We had the part of the World Economic Forum, and we were talking to them about what they might do infrastructure-wise, because they have a lot of ports around the world, and I said, you need to build a railway across Africa, because the reality is, to move things from China and Asia to Brazil, it's not easy, right? You got to go through the Panama Canal, and we know what happens there. But of course, Sudan is in the way, right? But when the United States built the railway across the United States, Indians were in the way. So I mean, you've got to figure out a way to establish infrastructure even in light of difficulties and challenges. And if the supply chains of the world are going to get better, there's going to have to be a united international way to think about how things move. And I think supply chain leaders need to take the lead in talking about these things. And that's why I'm encouraging people to talk about. One of the reasons we put the book out, Flow: How the Best Supply Chains Thrive. It's you don't have to look too far other than the Amazon box on your front doorstep to know that Amazon was putting a distribution center as close as possible to you. Why? Because it was all about speed. Speed's the theory of everything. You got to be able to do things faster. So if you're going to do things faster, you better put the structure in place to make that happen. And we just aren't doing that well enough.
I want to talk about the outlook. This is Resilinc's take on it, and I want to get your feedback after. I know that, when we look at, the 12-month and the 18-month outlook, I know there's things like the midterm elections coming up, which could have huge, changes in the way the U.S. thinks. You've got what's going on in Russia. You have UK, obviously, with the new leadership coming in there. You've got military bases in Poland. You've got just things are becoming more volatile, a lot of them. And as we see prices go up on commodities, we see the regulatory. These are the type of things we're seeing in the next 12 months and 18 months. I want to get your take. What do you see that we're missing, or a different take on how we're looking at it?
Well, I would say the number one issue that corporations are going to face in the next 12 months is going to be inventory. Any recession tends to slow down economic growth to the point where inventory backs up in the supply chain. So just think of it as, just a backing up, a bottlenecking up of materials in the supply chain. And when that occurs, it's kind of like, musical chairs. When the music stops, somebody's not going to have a place to sit down. So you want to be on top of this issue. We saw in the last week or two, I think the major retailers were all sitting on boatloads of inventory, and they're talking about what they're going to have to do to discount this stuff to sell it, which will drive inflation down. So I think my personal feeling is we're going to probably have less inflation and more of a recessionary slowdown driven by interest rates. Interest rates are designed to slow the economy down. That's what they're doing, and they're going to raise them again. So, and that makes interest rates higher, makes inventory more expensive because it's cash tied up. Therefore, it is, expensive. So I think inventory would be the one that I would say would be probably top of mind for people. And again, visibility ties into that, right? Because if you can't see where it is, I'm working with one company now where, they say, well, the number one thing they want to have visibility over is their inventory, better view of their inventory all the way down through their supply chain. And they don't have it today. So I think those things will be what I think are going to be top of mind for a lot of people.
Okay. And it's interesting. Obviously, we have the holiday season not that far away. As we all know, this is when, the retailers have already, as you said, starting to put inventory. Do you see that we're going to have that same type of effect on logistics that we had, in the past year with?
Well,
we're in
the holiday season in the United States is highly seasonal. So I've always been in a position where, if you're not building it by July or August and shipping it in September, you're not going to have it for the Black Friday. So you've got to have a system in place now that's really thinking. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people are thinking long and hard right now about how much material do I really want to pump into this system if people aren't going to buy it. In a recession, people pull back, they pay more for gas, they're not going to buy something else. So I think that's what they're struggling with. And when that happens, when you've got the double effect of, inventory building up in the supply chain, and you got people buying less, it's just magnifying what's going to be a magnification of the issue. And knowing exactly where it is and who owns it and how quick you can get it when you need it, I think is going to be really, really important. So I would say that to me would be important. But the seasonality right now is the time. If you're in the retail side of the things, or you're in the consumer side of things, I should say, and you're looking at the holidays for 40% of your sales, you're going to be in a situation right now where you're making those decisions because you got to be building it now to be able to ship it in September and put it in your warehouse so you can sell it in Thanksgiving to Christmas.
Now, part of the issue has been the labor shortages. Obviously in the U.S. it's documented about, getting truckers and the port shortages in labor there. What are your thoughts on that getting better? I mean, obviously, politically there's a lot of flux about, who should be working, who works, who doesn't, and, stipends that the government gets. But, how do we get out of this labor shortage?
Yeah, well, I think the recession will help. I used to laugh as a chief procurement officer because I was the only one with a smile on my face during the recession, right? Because prices are falling, right? So if you're in procurement, right, you love a recession, right? That's the way it goes. I would say I got worried right away when I heard that they were going to authorize 18-year-olds to drive 18-wheelers, because I know a lot of 18-year-olds I wouldn't want to see behind an 18-wheeler. And,
right.
So I think, they're doing things like that and trying to extend the retirement age and things like that to get people on the roads. But I think my personal feeling is things are going to temper itself down. I think the demand surge that we saw coming out of the pandemic, I think a lot of that was just pent up money that hadn't been spent. There might still be some of that out there, but I would say, we're starting to see some companies cut back already. And when that happens, you're going to see, I've talked to a couple of trucking companies recently, and they're starting to see it. So I think there'll be a tempering of on some of the transportation demand. Maybe it'll be a little confusing for the next 6 months because of the holiday season coming up, but in general, I think hopefully it has its own, Machiavellian or Adam Smith, right? The invisible hand of the economy starts to adjust itself. So I think that might be what we'll see. Personally, that's my feeling anyway.
All right, great, thanks. I want to end with one slide before we get into Q&A. Just talk about, this was a case study we did with one of our multi-tier users in Toyota Raymond, and we've all been documented all about Toyota and how they lasted the first part of the 2 years of the COVID pandemic. And I think it's key that this was a customer of ours that really understood that they needed to map their suppliers and understand their sub-tiers. So they did part site mapping, and that's looking at an individual part and where is that individual part made, not something you can find on the internet. As we know, this is we need to know where the manufacturer is, where the assembly site is, where the distribution site, so that any disruption can be analyzed and mitigated. And I just wanted to end with this, just to give our viewers of the webinar a little bit of information on one. Please, feel free to ask us questions about how our customers are, dealing with, any shortages, any disruptions that are happening in their supply chain, and understanding the criticality of mapping. So I want to switch it over. I think we're right about the time for Q&A. So Melissa, you have some questions from our audience today?
I do. I have some great questions that came in, and let me say thank you to you both for that great conversation. So one of the first questions we received, what kind of long-term contracts are required to entice a supplier to create a new manufacturing facility in a country that's closer to an OEM's domestic markets? And does this vary by industry?
I'll let Tom answer that.
Okay. What's interesting now is whether you're talking about states or whether you're talking about countries. I think there's a lot of information out there. Most states have development offices. Mexico does. If you look at the different states in Mexico, they all have their own development offices. I think just helping suppliers who may need help. And let's be honest, some suppliers may be very national in their situation or very local in their situation. Helping them put that together, I think is important. If you want them to be next to one of your facilities, which is actually in an area where you have a lot of information, I think have a meeting with them and with the representatives of the state that actually can help communicate what those opportunities are. There's a lot of infrastructure, a lot of training grants. There's a lot of things that facilitate that movement of things. And then when you get to the contracts, I would say, whatever contract you have with them, I'm a big believer that they have to be competitive. I never, in my life, just my own personal experiences, I've never signed a long-term 5-year contract that made sense 3 years later. No matter what, for various reasons, the world changed, supplier changed, I changed, products changed. All those things happen. Unless it's a services-based contract, products are too changeable. I wouldn't get hung up on the contract, but they're more likely to win more business and have a closer relationship with you if they're in your neighborhood. If you don't have leverage over the supplier, that's a different story. Sometimes you may have to rethink how you're sourcing material. You might have share of business awards right now where you're giving it to 3 guys, and maybe if one guy is willing to open a factory near you in the next 3 years, you'll commit a higher share of business to him. So the contract might not be as critical in terms of term as much as in terms of amount, just because there's financial value for you to have him closer. The safe shoring comment. And contracts to me, every time I signed a contract, I always had 3 things going through my head. One was, what would the stockholders think? What would my company think of what I'm signing? But number one for me is, how do I get out of this contract? How do we get out of it? I mean, so I think you want to, whether you're in procurement or supply chain, you want to keep flexibility on your side, but that doesn't mean you can't convince suppliers that there's other enticements that would make it better for you and them. Their lower inventory for them, for example, because you're not pushing as much to them for longer periods of time, things like that.
Super, thank you. Glenn, I got one for you. What are the biggest hurdles that organizations face when implementing technologies such as supply chain mapping, and why aren't organizations implementing these kinds of technologies today?
Well, I will tell you the biggest, and it really doesn't matter if it's supply chain or what industry you're in, the biggest hurdle is change management for any implementation of any technology and anything you want to do. It's because if people aren't bought in, they don't like to change. We all know inherently we do not like change. And so if you're not bought into why you need to change, what the benefit is for you, and people are in it for themselves a lot of times, what's in it for me, they have a reluctance on doing these type of projects. The key thing is to commit. So if you are committed to doing a mapping endeavor with Resilinc, and you're willing to put the effort that you have to put, because it's not, Resilinc's a tool, it's going to do everything for you. That's just not the case. There is no technology like that you can buy. All technologies take three things, or to be, change managers, as I said: people, process, and technology. So we're the technology. We can bring you the best practices and the technology and how to use the processes, and we can bring you part of the people, but you have to have the people also, and they've got to be bought into the process and brought into, what is going to happen by us putting the effort in to map the supply chain.
Super, thank you. Question for you, Tom. You discussed the investments China is making in Silk Road. What is your sense of the reality of China's economic status? There are whispers that China's debt liquidity is potentially a major risk for these investments. Since we can't count on the region to be transparent with the actual economic situation, what is your sense of how much of a chance there is going to be significant economic turmoil in the region?
Well, what China does with its currency will always control, the competitiveness. Right now, they're making China competitive by, devaluing the yuan so that the prices will fall and people will buy more in China. So exports will rise. So I think, when you have a government that can actually manipulate and manage itself that way, you're going to have ways to control that outcome. I wouldn't worry about so much their debt. I mean, I think, I can't recall the exact number, but I know they're one of the largest buyers of U.S. bonds. So I would be more concerned about just thinking about the supply environment there, because we've just been dealing with so many shutdowns. I mean, I'm sure I could talk to everybody on this call and they'd all have stories about what they had to deal with over the last couple of years because something was happening related to the shutdown in China. And it started, when Apple's guidance in February of 2020, when they said, we've got a problem in Wuhan, China, and everybody was like, what? They changed their guidance in February 2020 because of this thing. So I think that would be my thought on it. I wouldn't get too hung up on China defaulting or China issues like that. That I can't see that ever being feasible. It'd be like the U.S. defaulting, right? Well, if the U.S. or China default, then the world defaults, right? So, it's that they'll print more money before that happens. So I would be more thinking that way about it and trying to, I mean, trade is good for the world. I mean, the trade, the Pacific, Trans-Pacific Partnership, Pacific Trade Partnership that never happened, or it happened without the U.S. I think all these things are helpful to supply chain. And as supply chain people and supply chain risk people, we really need to speak up about, de-risking the world and de-risking supply chains and trying to get to the point where our voice is heard more loudly. In the past, you don't have to go very far. We're logistics and procurement and materials management people. were not a voice that many companies really heard from. We were transactional. But now with information, we become real powerful. Whether you're sitting on a business continuity team or you're looking at risk management for your company, you're all have a voice to really help articulate a safer way forward. And I think it's good to put your preferences out there, and whether or not the companies choose to do everything that but I think our voice is important, that we clearly articulate what those things are. But I wouldn't have a Chicken Little approach. The sky is falling. I don't think that's going to happen. I think if it, as I said, if that were to happen, it'd be bigger. There'd be bigger issues than just one product, one company kind of thing. We focus more on how do you continuously improve. I always go back to a book I read 20 years ago called Non-Zero. It's about human destiny and how we're all going to get, we're all working together more than we ever were in any century before. So, no matter how difficult you think things are, you don't have to go back into the 1900s or the 1800s or the 1700s and look at conflict and look at how disruptive. There was no such thing as a global supply chain. Why? Because people didn't cooperate. They didn't work together. They didn't know how. They didn't have the technology, didn't have the tools, didn't have the desire. Maybe there was some stuff going on between Europe and the United States until the United States said, cut their ties had a war with England. So I think in general, things are moving in the right direction. It's just, there are always these little periodic disruptions. Our job is to constantly look past them and try to come up with better ways.
Thank you. So I have a question that came in on ESG, which really seems to be the risk area of the hour. It's making a lot of headlines. So we had noted it on our forward-looking slide. I think both of you can answer this in your own way, but the question was, what do companies need to be aware of when it comes to ESG related regulations? Germany just implemented its Due Diligence Act. The US just launched a Forced Labor Act banning certain goods from China. Do you have any thoughts on that? So Tom, I'll set it to you first. Is this a risk area that is valid? And then Glenn, maybe I'll have you follow up on, what can companies do from a risk perspective to tackle it?
Absolutely. I mean, you don't have to look to any corporation, even look at Europe. There's a procurement pledge. I work with some major funds that are looking at how to invest in sustainable companies and startups and everything. And this is just becomes so necessary. Even if you just talk about global warming, it's become more necessary. And so we're trying to do everything we can to improve the social side of the human condition, and we're trying to improve the environment we live in. So those are directionally correct. You can debate which side of the environment debate you're on, but I always try to be directionally correct. And if you're working ESG right now, I know from sitting on public boards, it's top of the agenda. You're not going to find a public board of a public company right now that doesn't have ESG at the top of its agenda. And if that's what the stockholders want, and that's what the stakeholders inside the company are doing, then that's what we need to be doing. And I would just encourage that kind of thinking rather than trying to say, should we be doing it or how should we be doing it? I think it's going to be done. It is being done by top companies. It's expanding across the supply chain.
Yeah, what I'll add to that is what we see specifically is, as Tom said, it's coming top down that we have to look at ESG, and there's many different ways to do it. And I think, unfortunately, there are companies out there who are looking at it at only tier 1 because they're not doing the mapping piece. So they're only looking at their tier 1 and saying, okay, we're compliant on ESG because all of my tier 1 suppliers, are in this box and they all check it and everything looks good. And then there's a news event that happens and they find out, guess what? They weren't really compliant because that tier 1 was using a tier 2 who was using another tier 3 who was using, in an area where maybe they were using, too much water from what they were allocated at, or they weren't doing things sustainably. So I think the key is understanding your total supply chain, like we started out talking about, and then understanding, if you're going to do ESG, you've got to understand it at that level. So in all of your tiers, so that you know what's really going on, and then can look at that risk. The one thing we do, here at Resilinc is give you the ability to aggregate all of your risks. So you can see financial risk, you can see cyber risk, you can see ESG risk all in one place. And so your commodity buyers or commodity managers can understand their book of suppliers and say, you know what, we've got a risk here. How do we mitigate that?
Thank you. I think this is another one you both can probably answer. It's very big picture. What do you think is the next big disruption? Is it a certain risk area? Is it in a certain part of the world? If you could each answer that, that would be great.
Go ahead, Glenn.
No pressure, Glenn.
Let me pull my crystal ball out. It's interesting. I think I really think the next big disruption is one we're not looking for. Truthfully, I think there's something lingering out there that we haven't thought of, because most of the ones that we are keeping our eye on, we talked about the Silk Road, we talked about the invasion of Taiwan, and Tom, talked about really an earthquake, which is something we don't have our eye on per se, would be a bigger disruption. And I think that's where we're at. It's more those unplanned events that aren't something like a politically motivated, war or some financial collapse. I think there's, it's interesting. I live in Florida, right? So I'm in where I have to be cognizant of hurricanes, and we're in hurricane season. This hurricane season so far has been really unique, that we haven't seen those major storms coming across from Africa. And maybe we're taking our eye off the ball because it's been so easy, and maybe something like that will happen. So I just think there's something that we're not looking for. To me, it's going to pop up. Tom?
Yeah, I would add, back to what I said, supply chains are selfish. So if supply chains are selfish, you really need to look at your supply chain and say, what would take me down? Military guys call it a kill shot, right? What one thing actually takes the like Jenga, the wooden blocks, right? Which one causes the whole thing to fall? So in every supply chain, you've got something that basically is a kill shot. Every product has a kill shot. Might be one single source supplier, and I define single sourcing is you're in one country, in one factory, or one location in one factory. So if you want to de-risk it, you go to two factories, or two countries, or two cities in the same country, right? You want to de-risk location, you want to de-risk it that way. And I remember looking at, okay, yeah, TSMC's Taiwan Semiconductor, they foundry that makes 80% or more of the world's chips. Do you have things in two buildings? Back to factory fires, right? Do you have it all in one building, or do you have it in two? If Taiwan Semiconductor has another factory in Thailand, are you also making it there and in Taiwan? In other words, are you dual sourced? So I would look at my supply chain. I would look at my bill of material. I would take my bill of material apart, and I'd say, what is on that bill of material going to take me down? What's the kill shot on that bill of material? In other words, I can find the other stuff. I can dual source it. I can triple source it. I can do all kinds of things. I can even do a workaround. I can even re-engineer parts of this thing, but there's one thing I can't re-engineer. There's one thing that I'm stuck on. And that would be the more disruptive thing for you personally, for your company personally, than to say that, a tidal wave is going to, knock out Hawaii. So, I think in fact, back to what I said about Hsinchu, I remember talking to the COO or the CEO and saying, if there's over an 8.0 earthquake in Hsinchu, Taiwan, I'm probably not going to go to work the next day, and I'll be resigning, because there's nothing we can do for the next 16 weeks. We're out of parts. So look at it that way. Look at what is really massively disruptive to you, that one thing. It might be two things, but there's usually something that is nothing you can do about it.
Thank you. I think we're going to wrap it up with that. I think that was a really good endpoint for this webinar. I really appreciate Tom and Glenn, your time today. That was a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for our audience for attending today. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. We will be sending out a recording soon. And in the meantime, please take care and we will catch you on the next webinar. Thank you again, Tom and Glenn.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.